This is primarily focused on due diligence and structuring for mergers and acquisitions, transactions and divestments, financing transactions and group reorganisations. So without further ado, I introduce Ian.
Thanks, Tamara. It's somewhat of a hard act to follow coming after Bill Shorten announcing major changes to trust law, but I'll do my best with this session. The idea behind this session was to focus on some of the issues that arise for vendors in readying a privately owned business for sale. And the reason why we thought this was a good topic was really recent experience, which has involved, I think more increasingly, transactions whereby privately owned businesses are being acquired by perhaps more sophisticated taxpayers. And that may be in the private equity space. So there has been quite a few recent, over the last few years, quite a few recent private equity deals that have involved private equity houses, be they Australian or multinationals, acquiring privately owned businesses. But it's also some listed companies acquiring quite significant privately owned businesses. And I guess that's the other issue with trying to define what we're talking about. Obviously, there's a huge variance in the type of privately owned vendors that we could be talking about, anywhere from smaller business operations up to quite significant business operations. And at the end of the day, obviously, when you think about the issues that might arise if you're advising a vendor, the vendor's tax profile and complexity will be a key point. In terms of the aims of today's session, what I hope to do is to give you a roadmap of some of the key issues that are likely to arise if you're doing an M&A transaction with a vendor of privately held assets. Also think about how do you plan for the sale, and really what key issues will a purchaser focus on, and that's really from recent experience in looking at exactly what the purchaser or the purchaser's advisor will expect you or your vendor to provide or to have when you actually do a sale transaction. And the other sort of task is how do you actually get the vendor's house in order to prepare assets for sale. The key topics of what we'll cover, we'll look at the structure of the sale. We'll talk a bit about some perhaps relatively simple structuring issues involved with selling either assets or shares. We'll talk a bit about pre-completion distributions and the circumstances when they can be made and what are the issues. We'll talk about liabilities and how you might deal with liabilities associated with the target company as part of a sale transaction, and we'll focus on the debt forgiveness measures. We'll talk briefly about pre-completion restructuring, so what are the key income tax and stamp duty issues that might arise with pre-completion restructuring transactions. We'll briefly touch on some tax consolidation issues, which is really looking at some of the joint and several liability or the liability issues that arise when you dispose of an entity out of a consolidated group. And we'll briefly touch on vendor due diligence. All these issues are dealt with in some detail in the paper, so if I rush over things in today's session, the papers are a good reference point for all these issues. I guess the point is, and the reason for the question mark is, as I said, there are likely to be many other issues that we won't talk about today that will be relevant for you if you're advising in a vendor on a private sale. And they may, depending on the size of the assets, if you're below the 6 million threshold, the small business CGT concessions may be relevant. You may have pre-CGT assets, getting rarer, I guess, these days to have pre-85 assets, but nonetheless, they still exist. You might have some Division 7A issues that you need to deal with or that drive the structure of a transaction. And there's a whole other heap of vendor issues that might be relevant. So if we start with the basics, and I apologise, some of this stuff is quite simple, and you may know all the key considerations from an income tax and a stamp duty perspective that I'm going to talk about. But the initial choice that a vendor faces when they decide to sell assets is typically, where assets are held in a corporate structure, is typically, am I better off selling assets or shares?